consequences. Firstly, we need to stress that agriculture faces quite different challenges than the other sectors already facing an emission trading system. The main being that our emissions are, to a large extent, biogenic emissions. They arise from natural cycles, cyclical processes such as methane from livestock, but also nitrous oxide from soil. And this means that these emissions, I don't say that we should not mitigate them, I say that they are not as easy to control. They are heavily influenced by environmental factors like the weather, like soil conditions, like geographic location and so on, making it a bit more difficult to control and to measure and to report and so on. And this variability really underscores the need for a more tailored and nuanced approach when it comes to our emissions. And we also must see that the aim is not that agriculture should reach zero emissions. These biogenic emissions are necessary. If we want food production, there will be biogenic emissions, but they're cyclical. So when we speak about the percentage of emissions coming from agriculture within the European Union, I would say that maybe the best scenario is that 100% of the emissions comes from agriculture and are biogenic emissions. Just to challenge our mind of how we compare the different emissions. And our reflection on the study exploring this Agri-food ETS have revealed quite some concerns. We think that such a system could impose disproportionate costs for farmers. I think you have already heard this. Many farms already now operate under narrow economic profit margins. And we see a risk that also these systems, even if it's upstream or downstream, that would try to shift the cost, would risk penalizing the farmers, not giving proper incentives, time or actual tools to reduce the emissions. We know that the emissions you want to reach, the emissions you want to target with these kind of systems are on farm, so they are not downstream, for example, which means that the farmer will be affected. And we also see that this approach, depending on how it looks like, could lead to increased food prices, of course, which could also risk food security and the potential loss of competitiveness for the agricultural sector, the European agricultural sector. And therefore also, I think we have to address emission leakage. And then we also have to ask ourselves the questions, also linking to the future vision we will see in just some days. Where do we want to see European agriculture in 2030, in 2040, in 2050? Which role will we have on a global market? Which role can the European agriculture have when we look at a globe where more and more of our neighbors outside Europe, also within Europe, will have difficulties in producing food due to climate change? So what is our role? What should we actually produce? And then we must also recognize that the emissions from agriculture being biogenic, but they're also quite diffuse. So when we speak about the other ETS sectors, we have often larger industries. And now we talk about millions of small and medium-sized farms. Also have larger farms, of course, but there is a great variety. And unlike more centralized industrial facilities, we cannot just only shift to a low-carbon technologies and alternatives. It's not like the transport sectors where we know we have alternatives we can shift now. There are, of course, a lot of things we can do, but that will require significant investment and time. And many of the required innovations, when we look, for example, at the study from Agora, we see the feed additives to reduce livestock methane, as an example. Or we have precision farming that could reduce the emissions. But some of them are still at the infancy, and we need to develop and put a lot of research and innovation in this, of course. But they are also often financially out of reach for many farmers, which means that we need another kind of support to actually achieve this. So the question is, will I just complain about the systems which we have looked at today, or what can we actually do? What do we want? What do the agricultural sector actually want? And I think that there are some low-hanging fruits. That is not the question. The question is, how can we support the farmers? The path we take forward must be one that would incentivize farmers and supports farmers as partners in climate action and not as scapegoats. And I think the rhetorics in this discussion is also very important. So we would rather advocate for alternative approaches that could incentivize sustainable farming and sustainable practices. And these have depend on the region, on the country, what is actually needed. And do that while safeguarding our food systems, our rural livelihoods and biodiversity. And for example, we can look at the voluntary carbon farming, the promotion of certified carbon removals, and also investments in research and innovation and advisory services. And we see them as quite promising ways of actually reducing the emissions. So to, in an efficient way, reach the climate targets, not only for 2030, but 2040 and then on to 2050, we empathize that we need a multi-phased approach that would integrate these kind of incentives with a bit more regulatory clarity and also market-driven solutions, rather than relying on these kind of compliance-based mechanisms, which we can see in, for example, an Agri-food ETS. So, given our conditions, the biogenic nature of most of the emissions, and variable climate dependencies, we argue that we require a more tailored policy tool, or a set of tools that would support both emission reduction but also climate adaptation and strengthen biodiversity and safeguarding biodiversity. And we would also urge policymakers to ensure the policy coherence between the different regulatory frameworks. For example, the alignment of a potential Agri-food ETS must go hand in hand with the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, for example, and should minimize the administrative burden. And I know we speak a lot about simplification and administrative burden, but if we can have tools and mechanisms that can actually reduce the administrative burden, we would free that time and energy, effort and finance for the farmer to actually do things that would matter for the climate. So this is about what do we want to use our time and money into. So harmonization and clarity is actually essential to make it possible for each farmer to contribute and to achieve climate action at farm level. So to conclude, from Copa-Cogeca side, we stand ready to collaborate and to continue this discussion with the industrial stakeholders, with policymakers, with environmental organizations. We think that we need to develop a strategic climate policy for agriculture, a policy that will place the farmer at the center and promoting a just transition while we are safeguarding food production, enhancing biodiversity and climate resilience, of course. Because climate change is the biggest threat we face as a sector. We are already now very much affected, and of course we are committed to contribute to this and do our work on climate change. But then we have to work together, and we need to look in a holistic way of all of these kind of aspects and see how agriculture also is a sector a bit different compared to the other ones. I know that the ETS is very successful for the fossil emissions, for example, but when it comes to agriculture we have to have a more holistic approach, and maybe to start a broader discussion before we go into these very specific details on the emission trading system, for example. So looking forward to continue the discussion, and would love to talk more to you also in the break.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you very much for your reaction. And Rabobank has been mentioned earlier on, and it is indeed yet another angle of the stakeholder spectrum. So I'd like to welcome Alex Datema, who's the Director for Agriculture and Food at Rabobank.
Thank you. I'll start with the wine, because my foremost task here is to bring wine to every speaker and panelist, and I forgot so far, so I would urge them to drop by me to get a bottle of wine. But there's a little story about this wine. It's a Dutch wine, and I'm not going to say it is a positive or negative impact of climate change, but that we have Dutch wine is indeed an effect of climate change, so we have to really be sure of that. But for the panelists and the speakers, drop by me for the bottle of wine. Well, I work at Rabobank in the Netherlands, but I'm also a dairy farmer in the north of the Netherlands, so I try to make always the contact between the practice of farming and working in a bank. Yes, we are indeed involved in climate change, and even the source Rabobank, like all the banks, we look at our financed emissions. That's how much of the emissions of CO2 can we link to what we finance. And if we look at the Netherlands, the agriculture sector is top. If you look at how much emissions that we can link to our financing in instruments, and the greenhouse sector is on top, and the next sector is the dairy farming. So from the policy we have, we think we have to look at the sectors and say, what can we do? What is there to be reached, and where do we move? And for a bank, you have two options. I always say it's quite easy. If you want to reduce our financed emissions, get rid of customers with high emissions. That's quite easy for a bank. But that's not our goal, because we want to be a food and agri bank in the future. So we want to talk to our clients, our customers, and help them to reduce their emissions. Not by saying to them, well, find another bank, but stay with us and we will try to help you to reduce your emissions. That's our ambition if we look at Rabobank as a food and agri bank in Europe, in the Netherlands, but all over the world. If I look at Europe, especially at the Netherlands, I think one of the most things that is missing right now is that there is no incentive for most of the individual farmers to do something. Every farmer, like every citizen, knows that we have to do something about climate change. They have to reduce our CO2 emissions. But on farm level, there's no issue. There's not an incentive to do it, because we have agreements on what we have to do on the national level. But translated to the farm level that they did in Denmark, we never did in the Netherlands. So the farmers in the Netherlands more or less stay still. So I think the first step that we have to take is to bring, if you want to bring down the CO2 emissions, you have to set a goal on farm level so that the individual farmer is starting to move. And if you do that, and you give them an incentive, especially when you give them a carrot, they will start to move. If you look at the greenhouses in the Netherlands, they are moving because they want to do them themselves. But if you look at the dairy sector, you just heard something about Nestlé, but Friesland Campina, a large cooperative dairy industry in the Netherlands, they pay their farmers a higher milk price for farmers who bring down the CO2 emissions on a liter of milk. And the farmers react within a year. They will start to bring down their emissions. So sometimes you don't even need a stick, you just can use a carrot to make sure that people are going to move. But the first thing is they have to know that they have to move, and they have to have a goal on their farm level to reach. That's the first step that you have to take to get somewhere. So, and I think we lack that first step on a lot of issues. The second thing is about CO2 removals. How do we work on that? And when I look at it, I get always a little bit uncertain what is the right way to address such a thing. I think there's a lot of discussion about the data, can we measure it and can we prove it? Well, I think that's temporary. But in a few years we will be able to measure it and to prove it. That's an issue for now, but not for the future. The real issue for the future is in my opinion, do we keep the removals within the dairy sector or the food and agriculture sector, or do we sell the removals to the car industry? Because there lies, in the end, the big issue. Do we want, and I think what Copa-Cogeca was saying, well, you cannot have a food and agri system with no emissions, but we have to bring them down as far as possible. I think one of the main hurdles for reaching the goals is that there is not enough money within the value chain of food and agri to do large investments in sustainability and CO2 emissions. So we need more money in the value system and in the food and agri system to let the farmer invest in the future. But I'm not sure that the removal of carbon is the right way to get more money into the system. Because if we want to get more money in the system, that means that people from out the system has to pay for it. And that means that the removal of carbon is not put on the conto of the food and agri sector, but it's put on the conto of the car industry or the television industry. So I really am hesitating a little bit how to work for it. And the proposal that Jeroen presented, one way it sounds good, and the other way my hesitation is there from, does it bring extra money to the system? Because I think that's what we need. If we want to have a more sustainable future in the food and agriculture, not only for CO2, you have to look at it in an integrated way, then we need more money in the system. And this is, I think, the biggest issue that we have. We can look at everything, but in the end, we have to pay a little bit more for our food, or in one or another way, and make sure that the money lands on the farm level so that the farmer can invest in the things he has to do. I believe in the entrepreneurship of the farmers. And if you give them a goal, they will work on it, and they probably will get they will probably set large steps. And I think the best way to do that and to start that and to make farmers enthusiastic is to start with a carrot. And in the end, probably we need a stick to make sure that the latest farmers who are a little bit behind are also taking the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. And I'd like now to invite Torsten Hasford to react. And Torsten is the chief economist of the green think tank Concito.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me the time to come here today. I had some slides, but I don't know if we can get them. But whilst the slides are being found, I can start talking. Of course, we're a Danish think tank, we're an independent Danish climate think tank, and I of course talk from a position of privilege, because we have a climate tax. We're going to have a climate tax on the emissions of agriculture by 2030. We are small, we're a rich country, we have a very consolidated agricultural sector. What in Denmark is a small farm is, in a European context, a large farm. We have a lot of data on all our farms. We have a lot of historic data. It was already presented, those facts. So of course, I come from a position of privilege. But one thing I'd like to say is that, or my encouragement is to try to accelerate the point where we actually cross the threshold, where we get to the point where we actually implement the things that are needed for agriculture to move on. Because I've followed this debate in Denmark for the last 4-6 years about agriculture. And as long as you're in the space where you're discussing things, there will be a lot of boogeymen presented, there will be a lot of uncertainty, but as soon as you get to the point where you actually start implementing policies, things start to consolidate. Things start to become clearer, also to the farmers, because to Danish farmers today, it's a lot more concrete than it was 2 years ago. And I'm sure that it's not something that's grown in their own garden. It's not something that they wished for, that they had a carbon tax. But now today, they can actually see what they're going to expect. They can actually start planning to what they're going to expect. And they start looking for the solutions that reduce their emissions. Because before you reach that point, before you get those policies, you are in a limbo, which creates a lot of uncertainty, which creates a lot of protests, really. So my encouragement would really be to move forward to that point. But I was actually going to talk about on the Trinomics report, which we have actually looked into, which is great work by you, and we are very impressed with what you have achieved, and we very much support the idea of an ETS, and I can only repeat what Jeroen also said, that very much in agreement with most of the things that you said, that it's very important that we actually create a solution space, that we create a space that involves the farmers in trying to make those solutions. And there's no silver bullet for farming. But then again, I was in the energy sector for many years, and if we look back 10-15 years, there was no silver bullet in the energy sector. If we look at the energy sector now, it seems obvious what the solutions are. We have solar, we have wind, it's cheap, batteries are coming. But if we go back 10 or 15 years, the energy sector looked at this problem and they said, how can we ever? We need our coal plants, we need our natural gas plants. The same will happen to agriculture as soon as we start creating a solution space, as soon as we face the farmers with incentives. And those incentives can of course be the carrot, but I also believe that the stick will definitely have to be involved in that aspect. I'm now going to rush up. I think I was only given 6 minutes. I've probably already eaten quite a lot of that. But can I move forward? No. Click. Yes. So, yeah, it's been said before, few emissions in agriculture, and the CAP, as our own studies show, have proven ineffective at reducing agricultural emissions. But that's maybe not saying that the CAP needs to reduce agricultural emissions, because there are many wishes, many desires for the agriculture, organic farming, regenerative farming, and maybe that is the purpose of the CAP, of supporting these things. Maybe we need something else to reduce emissions. And the question that you should keep on top of your mind is, when someone talks about agriculture, you need to focus on how will what you're saying reduce carbon emissions. Because when it comes to agriculture, we often get distracted by other things. And those are not unimportant things, but we get distracted by things such as life in the countryside or biodiversity. And those are important things, and we need policies that support these things. But when we're talking about carbon reductions, we need to focus on how will what you're proposing reduce carbon emissions. And sometimes we tend to forget that when we talk about it. So we looked at the trinomics works, and we very much ended up in the same point as Jon described in the downstream model. The problem that we have very many farmers in the EU, I think I've heard a number of 9 million. So 9 million actors working with an ETS, that's not going to happen. That's where the downstream model, where it's dairy, the producers, the meat, dairy processors, will be the main carriers of that. But then, and I'm going to do slightly quickly, I'm going to jump, I've mentioned the solution space. We need to create a link between the processors and the farmers. We need a middleman who can ensure that the farmers get the benefit in an ETS. Effectively, we can see 3 pathways of how reductions are going to come about. One of them is, of course, we introduce an increased cost on producing high emission foods. That will reduce demand. But actually, what our study shows that even with a high tax in Denmark, it has very little effect on the consumers. It's mostly a boogeyman. The consequences of a carbon tax in agriculture is fairly limited. Then, of course, we can have Danone, Nestlé, and others who can try increasingly doing hybrid products. So not just a dairy product, but maybe a dairy product with a bit of plant. That's pathway number 2. But very important is that with a downstream model, which is probably the only realistic model, we need somehow for the farmers to see the benefits. We need to have clear incentives, clear value, so that small farmers aren't forced to be negotiating with Nestlé in terms of how much they're going to get for what they provide. We need a relatively clear framework of reductions for farmers and compensation so they can see the advantages of entering into these things. I think I've about used my time, so I'm quickly going to go forward. We need a cap which doesn't necessarily reduce emissions, but certainly which doesn't work in the opposite direction of an ETS. We need the revenues from an ETS going back to the farm sector. We need a focus on all environmental objectives, but they don't need to distract us from the purpose of reducing our emissions. That's it for now. But if you have any questions, you're welcome to come and ask me.
Thank you very much, Torsten, and indeed there will be opportunities for questions to you directly during the coffee break, but also to our speakers during the panel to maybe go a bit more in depth into some of these remarks that have been made. I'd like now to invite our last speaker of the reaction series, if I may call it that, and I'd like to welcome Mathieu Mal from the European Environment Bureau.
Good afternoon, everyone. I believe I'm the last person standing between you and your cup of tea, which is not a great position to be in, but I'll try my best. We're all we have a lot of anticipation waiting for the vision for agriculture and food, of course, by the Commission that's supposed to come out in this week. But I thought since we're waiting for that one, I might share with you a little bit of EEB vision for agriculture and food and the climate. As we've heard, agriculture suffers the consequences of the climate crisis in many forms, from erratic and extreme weather to the depletion and the degradation of the natural resources upon which it depends. So tackling the issue of climate change is really in the best interest of the sector. 90% of the EU agricultural greenhouse gases come from just 3 sources or activities. Methane, mostly direct emissions from animal rearing, which every year emits more than twice the amount of greenhouse gases that Belgium as a country does. Nitrous oxide from fertilizer use, which is emitting at about the same rate as Belgium. And CO2 from the peat soils that have been drained and depleted, mostly for agricultural use. Anybody want to guess how many Belgium's worth of emissions? 2. So now you know EU agricultural emissions with Belgium for scale. EU agricultural emissions, as we've also seen before, have close to stagnated for the past 2 decades. And with current and planned measures, we're looking at a decrease of a few percentage points over the next 15 years. And this, of course, is nowhere near the reductions that we need to get the agricultural sector on track with climate neutrality for the EU by 2050. There are many different ways of dealing with these emissions, but good ways of dealing with them are less plentiful. The temptation of resorting to technological solutions as a panacea for all problems is very strong. Solutions that hold the promise of business as usual, just a tweak in the process, the key to even further intensification, better efficiency, larger scale. Some of these solutions can be part of the answer, but on their own they will fall short. They will fall short because they're partial fixes that just plaster over the cracks, creating the illusion of progress, while in fact paving the way for, in some cases, unexpected and in most cases unwanted long-term consequences, whose financial and societal cost will long and far surpass whatever investment costs to begin with. On their own they will fail because they do not address the issues at their core, but instead they lock us further into the unsustainability of a system that is built on mountains and rivers of external toxic inputs and so-called ghost hectares of deforested land. That's pretty grim, but there's also good news. And the good news is that the right way of dealing with these emissions will also help us achieve our other environmental and societal objectives. Nature-friendly farming is not an oxymoron. There are already farmers all over Europe that are showing us how to do it. There need not be trade-offs between improving the health of our environment, the stability of our climate, the well-being of our animals, and the prosperity of our farmers and consumers. We need to rear way fewer animals and do so in healthier and more natural ways. We need to eliminate our dependency on synthetic inputs, and peatlands should be wet. It sounds pretty simple, and it's also achievable with the right measures. Studies show this. We can feed Europe with healthy and sustainable food and produce the inputs for a bioeconomy, all while drastically reducing our negative impact on the environment and on the climate. But for that we do need the right policies in place. And so when we discuss different policy options, we would argue that we should keep in mind that we want to achieve all of this and not just some. So not emission reduction in isolation, but steep emission reductions in a context where we restore our natural environment so that farming becomes resilient and maintains the natural resources it depends on to be viable in the long term. So climate measures need to be part of that bigger picture, in which we address not only what and how we produce, but also what and how we consume, where our food environments are shaped to nourish us and the planet back to health and away from disease. We have not forgotten about the Sustainable Food Systems Law, which was promised 5 years ago, which would be a great step in this direction. There may be different policy options that can achieve emission reductions. We could see how mandatory climate standards would be useful, we could see how an ETS could be effective, but regardless of the policy design, here are 5 guiding principles. 1. Without the guiding star, we do not know where we're going, and that's why we need an ambitious and binding 2040 target for agricultural emissions. 2. This target should be a gross emission reduction target, which means that it separates reductions from removals to make sure that the latter does not replace the former. 3. Fix existing policy that is currently broken. We have an industrial emissions directive, which regulates farmed animals. It does not include cattle, it does not have emission reduction targets, and it covers only the very largest operations. Fix it. We have applied emission pricing to the emissions generated by the production of fertilizers, applied to the emissions caused by their use. We have a common agricultural policy, which continues to turn public money into harmful subsidies, supporting large-scale industrial animal farming, input-dependent agriculture, and conventional agriculture on drained peat soils. And yet we're here talking about pricing emissions, which does make a lot of sense. But I do think it is a little bit weird to subsidize emissions with public money and then price them to reduce them. That would be like subsidizing the production of fossil fuels to then tax their use. Which is an absurd thing we're also doing, by the way, so we should fix that as well. If we address all that, then what is left for a new policy instrument to address? 4.